In this 10-year anniversary edition of Nintendo Unboxed, we're going to be revisiting the Japanese version of the Nintendo 64. If you're interested in seeing my original unboxing of this console, you can click the link to that in the description for this video. So here we have the Japanese Nintendo 64. Branded as such here, even in katakana. Typically I've seen Nintendo written in kanji, but it's written Nintendo 64. So this would be the first time that we would see a complete unification in branding and the physical design of the console. It was released the same way in all regions of the world, most likely in an attempt to kind of reduce production costs, so they didn't have to make two very different versions of the same console. And we would see that in the logo here with Nintendo 64, which is actually pretty cool. But I can remember as a kid when the console was first announced as the Ultra 64, I thought that was a very cool name and was a little disappointed when they changed it to the more generic sounding Nintendo 64. But in hindsight, as I just explained, I can understand why Nintendo would have wanted to do that. Calling it Ultra 64 in the United States and Nintendo 64 elsewhere, I don't know, just might have caused confusion. So we have this unified branding and aesthetic. And it's presented on the box in a similar way to the Japanese Super Famicom. Not with a photo, but with kind of an illustration using different colors that represent the system. Like the Super Famicom, Nintendo was sticking with the four colors. We've got green, blue, red, and yellow, all seen in that Nintendo 64 logo. Unfortunately, the colors on my box here are a little bit sun-faded, but if we flip it to the first long side here, we can kind of see what the blue originally was. We've got the branding. Information here most likely about the connections you were going to make, because Nintendo typically didn't include AC adapters with their consoles because with the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo they were backwards compatible. Here this would be the first time that we would see this different type of AC adapter, and we'll take a look at it once we get it unboxed. And that again was a little bit more unified between the regions. It had the same design. But then we would see a couple pictures of the main components you would be receiving. You'd be receiving your console and your brand new and very strange looking controller, as well as we got a list here of some of the other things that it came with. I think there's an instruction manual mentioned and of course the AC adapter, but no AV cables because you would be using the same ones for your Super Nintendo Entertainment System. So Japan was already well on board with reusing cables instead of giving you new ones every time you bought a product, even as early as 1996 when this released. So as we turn it to the short side, we got a white panel, or maybe it was a color at one time, but now it's white. And then we've got another blue panel here. This one is a little bit sun-faded. It doesn't match the blue on the other panel that we saw. But what we have on this one are some instructions for how to hold this brand new controller, the 3 positions. So that's kind of interesting there, that a controller would need some handling instructions. But it was definitely quite a shock to see that controller for the first time. Very unique looking back then and still today, I think. And then the final short side here, just the branding along with the barcode. On the bottom, I'm not going to see anything but styrofoam. Nintendo sticking with that convention here of housing everything in a styrofoam block with a cardboard overlay. So let's take a look and see what we find once we remove the cardboard overlay. We see right away our paperwork, our controller, and our AC adapter. And of course, beneath the paperwork is our Japanese Nintendo 64. Let's take a look at the paperwork first. Very different from the paperwork that you will see in my unboxing of the US Nintendo 64. I'm not quite sure what this is. It appears to be some sort of warning. Let's see if there are diagrams. I do see something about the power. Ah yes, lots and lots and lots of illustrations. We kind of saw this with the the Super Famicom Junior, there were lots of things in the instruction manual with a red X through it. Things you were not supposed to do with the console or expose it to as far as environmental conditions. So yeah, that I guess deserves its own rather large pamphlet here of all the caretaking measures you needed to have so that your N64 would last decades later, as this one still does. So here's our instruction manual, quite large in comparison. The instruction manuals we saw for the Famicom and Super Famicom were quite a bit smaller than this. Not too many colors going on here, but interesting they chose red for the start button and then for the power light. Opening it up, lots and lots of text to start. Continues on. And then finally some diagrams. Looks like we have some unpackaging information here. Oh, repackaging information. I always wondered what that compartment was for. I think maybe even in my first unboxing video I mentioned that I'm not sure if mine was missing something because of this rather large and empty compartment. But hey, if I had looked in the manual there, I would have seen that it's for repackaging the system. They're showing you how to do it once you've discarded the baggies, which of course I don't do. So it's to wind your AC adapter while it's still plugged into the system. That's interesting. Coiling up the cord there. Now we've got some very large diagrams here of the console and then the controller. And then of course with this new analog stick you would want to power up the system while it's in the neutral position. Otherwise it would read any other position as the neutral position, and then you would get what we call these days Joy-Con drift, which we don't like. So you always want to make sure that it's in the neutral position. Information about the AC adapter and then that expansion pack. Got the AC adapter connections here, and then here making the AV connections. Much like the Famicom and Super Famicom, you did not get any audio-video connections here. You had to buy that separately because Nintendo was banking on the fact that you probably already had something like that from your Famicom AV or from your Super Famicom. And that might have been the composite video and mono audio, or the composite video and stereo audio, or S-video and stereo audio. Japan got a whole lot more options than we did in the United States. So again, some more information about making those connections. Nothing about RF yet. You'd have to buy that separate RF modulator, and here that is. If your TV had only that threaded coaxial input, you'd have to use an RF switch, maybe that you had from your Famicom or Super Famicom. But since the Nintendo 64 in Japan and in the United States doesn't have any native RF output, you would have to buy this separate RF modulator at a store to make those connections. So yeah, it looks like they've got an RF switch that they designed specifically for the Nintendo 64, and then this one looks like the one that came with the Famicom, and I can see the part numbers, HVC for Famicom and NUS with JPN there for the Nintendo 64. So still quite a few video output options. In here, how to make the connections with the controller and inserting cartridges. And then it looks like we move on to a troubleshooting table. No images. I remember with the US versions of the Super Nintendo and the Nintendo Entertainment System, we got some illustrations of what some problematic picture screens might look like, but we don't get that here. Looks like we have some information, some specs here about the console and the AC adapter, and controller, that's the controller. So some specs about the controller, giving you the part numbers and everything. That's pretty thorough. Diagrams of everything. There's your Nintendo 64 or just plain old Nintendo branded RF cable, the RF modulator, all the various forms of the multi-AV out, your controller, and then your memory pack there. Or controller pack rather. And here probably got some warranty information, a nice kind of closing photograph there of the hardware. and then Nintendo. Maybe some contact information there for service. And then on the back, as per usual, we have the panel where you would put the name of the store where you bought it from, their contact information if you needed to get help from them. And then we have the sticker that bears the serial number, which should match the sticker on the bottom of the console. So speaking of the console, let's take a look at it. Get it out of the styrofoam. And the plastic bag. There is our Japanese charcoal color Nintendo 64. And right away we'll do our serial number comparison. We have NUJ12992948. We have a match. So flipping it back around to the top here. Pretty much a standard issue in all regions with the Nintendo 64 design, aside from the various colors such as Funtastic and Pikachu editions, and lots of two-tone. Sometimes the top part of the shell and the bottom part of the shell would be different colors. They would receive more of those variants in Japan than in the United States. But I've always really liked this charcoal version of the console, the original. I honestly think that the Nintendo 64 is one of Nintendo's sleekest and most attractive looking consoles. And maybe they agreed, because it was never re-released as a revision. There were no physical revisions to the shell. Certainly there were hardware revisions inside, and we had all the different color variants, but the footprint itself remained the same. So I think it was one of Nintendo's better designs. And it's pretty similar to the US version. However, on the top here is where we're going to see one of the differences, and we will see that difference in the cartridge slot. As you can see in there, there is kind of a black plastic cradle in the chassis there, and where my finger is going to be pointing, there is a little plastic tab right there, and then there is one that matches it on the other side here. And that is different to the US version, where that plastic cradle down here is a light gray color, almost the same color as this as the flaps here for the cartridge slot, whereas it's black here in the Japanese version. And then the placement of those tabs is to facilitate a physical region lockout, because at this point in Nintendo's history they were still implementing region locks, but it was physical with the Super Nintendo Entertainment System and the Nintendo Entertainment System, and of course the Famicom and Super Famicom. So in order to make that physical region lockout work, between the different regions, the cartridge was just a little bit different. Here I have the US version of Wave Race, and then the Japanese Shindo or Rumble Pack version of it. They look pretty similar, right down to the fact that there's no end labels for the cartridges. An unfortunate decision, even though I think the design of the cartridge is very attractive otherwise. If you turn it over to the back, you can see one of the main differences here, and that difference is the slot in the bottom of the cartridge. As you can see in the Japanese one, it's a little bit wider and a little bit more centered between the opening for the PCB board and the edge of the cartridge. And then here on the US one, it's more, it's not quite as wide, and it's right on the corner. So of course, a US cartridge is keyed to match a US Nintendo 64, and will not be able to make the connection with the PCB board into the cartridge slot in a Japanese unit, whereas the Japanese cartridge will have no problem making that connection. So Nintendo was still implementing a physical lockout at this time. However, if you were able to take this Japanese PCB and put it into the shell of a US cartridge, that would work. It would run. There's no software lockout. But that's one of the main differences of the console. As far as the memory expansion goes, even right down to the sticker that's on here telling you not to remove the null jumper pack that was included before you bought and installed your expansion pack. The sticker has English and Japanese on it, so that was common between the regions. On the sides, nothing of interest except for vents. On the front, we've got the 4 controller ports, which was one of the huge selling points for the Nintendo 64. Popular games such as GoldenEye would utilize the 4 players. And then the naming convention brought over from the Super Nintendo and Super Famicom, 1 dot, 2 dot, 3 dot, and 4 dot to kind of let you know which is player 1, 2, 3, and 4. On the back, I've got a big recessed chamber here for that AC adapter, and I much prefer that design because the big block is here in your console. It's not something you have to try to find a space for on your wall or in a power strip. So it ends with a regular plug, which we'll see. Then you've got your multi-AV out for your AV cables, which were not included. And from what I understand, it could only natively output composite and S-video. RGB was not traced up here from the board to the port. You would have to do that modification yourself, unlike the Super Nintendo Entertainment System and Super Famicom. Then on the bottom here, we've got a sticker with information about the console, and the sticker with the serial number that we already saw. The cover for the EXT port, which would actually be used in Japan for the 64DD peripheral. And if you're interested in more information on that, definitely take a look at my videos. I got a 3-part series on the 64DD. I'll put the links to those in the description for this video as well. In regards to the 64DD, these feet here, you can see if we flip it over, they are black instead of the charcoal gray. There's little holes here for the posts on the top part of the 64DD to go into as you would put the N64 on top of that peripheral. So they would actually be used. So that is the hardware. We've got our N64 control deck. Let's take a look and see what else we had in the package. Not too much. In the United States version, you'll see the AV cable was included. Not the case here. All we have is the controller, revolutionary as it was at the time, and designed and branded identically between the 2 regions, Japan and the United States, and Europe as well. So as we take a look at the controller, we've got the analog stick for this position, and you have access to all the buttons with your right thumb. And then of course if you wanted to hold it in this position, you would be able to use the D-pad for more 2D style games, of which there were not many on the Nintendo 64. Turning it over to the back here, we got the port for that memory pack, as well as eventually the rumble pack and the transfer pack. And Nintendo was also very pleased with their revolution of adding a Z trigger on the back, which I find to be quite comfortable. As weird as this controller is, the games that it was designed for, I think it's the best controller for those games. The controller cord was a little bit longer than you would have received with your Super Famicom, so that was a little bit of an upgrade. So outside of where the country of manufacture, there aren't too many variations. This particular one was manufactured in Japan. Most of the ones that I've seen from the United States were manufactured in China. So just a variation there in the country of manufacture. And then finally, the AC adapter. Not too exciting here, but I do enjoy that it ends with a normal plug. This monstrosity actually plugs into your N64, so you don't have to take up wall space with it. One of the main differences, though, is this: the Japanese version has a sticker on it. The U.S. version is just all black plastic with the information kind of embossed into the plastic there. However, there is a minor difference in that this is rated for Japanese house current, and the U.S. version is, of course, rated for U.S. house current. So whether you're using a Japanese or a U.S. Nintendo 64, I would recommend that you use the AC adapter for your region, because that's the one that's transforming your house current down. N64 can handle it either way, but you want to use the AC adapter for your region. So there you have the Japanese version of the Nintendo 64. I hope you enjoyed this unboxing video, and we'll stay tuned to World of Nintendo for lots more like it, especially those in the 10-year anniversary of the Nintendo Unboxed series playlist. In that, I am reshooting several of my earlier videos that could stand to have a little bit of an upgrade in the video quality. So I'll have those coming per the calendar that's been on the screen, and I hope that you'll stay tuned for those as well as all of the other content that I'll have for you here at World of Nintendo. Until that next one, take care.